And I can ask you to think something, and you'll think, and then your brain will start reacting to what you're thinking about, and then your body will react physiologically. So we can see now this chain from immaterial thought to material stuff happening in the brain, which is the realm of physics, really. So thoughts become things, is what we've learned. And so the idea of self brain surgery is learning how to take command of that top down control that we have, this incredible amount of agency and power that we have to not be limited by how our brains have always been behaving.
Yeah, it's interesting. I could go on and on about the difference between the brain and the mind, and
Yeah,
but I think you said it well. I mean, the brain is just a physical thing. You can hold a brain in your hand. It weighs about 3 pounds, right? But your brain is this
yep,
non-physical. I mean, your mind is this non-physical thing. It's ghostly. It's like a universe. And honestly, as a physicist, I can
that's
tell
right.
you that the world of the mind does not obey the normal scientific laws that the brain does, because the brain is a physical
That's right.
thing, the mind is a non-physical thing. But you raise an interesting point in the book, and just now you kind of hinted at it. And that is that we've always thought that the brain was kind of the master and the mind was the slave, that the brain determines what the
That's right.
mind thinks. But your book is all about reversing that. It's not just one way, it's a two-way street. Your book is all about how your
That's
thoughts,
right.
this immaterial thing, can affect the physical thing. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Absolutely. What it seems to be, from the best we can tell now, is that your brain really has never been in charge of you, and that's not the function your brain wants to serve. The brain basically exists to automate things for you so that it can come off of your mental plate, so you can begin to do things without having to use as much mental energy. And all of us have experiences with that, like when you learn and you take your kid to a new school for the first time. You have to think about every aspect of the drive. You have to be really involved in it, every stopping, every crossing guard, every red light, all that stuff. After a few days of driving, though, you don't even think about it anymore. You're talking to your kid, you're listening to the radio, you're text messaging, hopefully not while you're driving. But that process of all the things you need to pay attention to consciously becomes automated, and you wire in those things so your brain can take over some of those things for you. That's the difference between mental and physical. And then, as we've learned now, your brain really wants to warn you of potential or real threats and make sure you're safe. And your brain wants to basically filter the environment that you're in to show you the things that you're looking for. So all of us kind of think that reality is what we can see with our eyes. We all think that we're pretty savvy about seeing what's really out there. But we've learned now that most of the neurons in your brain's reticular activating system are inhibitory. So basically, you tell your brain what you're looking for. I'm going to have a bad day. I'm going to have a great day. Something bad's going to happen to me today. Then you start seeing evidence of that all around you, because your brain begins to
Mm.
filter for what you've told it to be important, told it to look for. And all of us have had that experience too, right? You notice a yellow Ferrari for the first time, and then all of a sudden you see them everywhere. You never thought you saw one before, and now you see them every day. That's called the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon, and that's an example of this filtering mechanism that your brain has. So reality really then turns out to be mostly based on what we're looking for.
So just to bring it down to earth a little bit, because as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking that the phrase mind over matter keeps coming to mind, right? That
That's right.
in many ways, I don't even know how to quite say this, but you said it very well. I'm just trying to put it in my own words that if we go into a day, let's say I get up in the morning and I'm just in a really bad mood for whatever reason,
Yep.
I'm just determined, I've just decided this is going to be a lousy day. And it ends
Yep.
up being a lousy day. So is that the essence of the concept of self brain surgery, that you can somehow take control of your thoughts, which then affects the brain, which affects the body, which affects your experience? Have I got that right, Lee?
Exactly. Exactly. Because the prevailing idea in our society basically is that you are what you are, that things are basically fixed. You inherited your personality from your parents, and it's been shaped over time by your experiences and traumas and things you've gone through. And that we basically just need to sort of tolerate how our brains behave and learn how to work with that. But now there's really compelling evidence that if you change what you're thinking about, you change the construct of the things that you instruct your brain to look for, then your brain begins to make structural changes in real time. So this is not some metaphor. Like you literally, the way the brain works is it's neurons connected to other neurons through microtubules and these structures that make what we call synapses, right? Little connections between neurons. And there are trillions of them in the brain. And it's been shown now in good studies that as soon as you change what you're thinking about, neurons begin to detach from other neurons and make new
Mm.
connections to other neurons to change what the brain is doing structurally. So when I call it self brain surgery, that's just to say, when I go to the operating room as a neurosurgeon and I perform brain surgery on somebody, I'm intentionally making structural changes in someone's brain for the purpose of helping them in some way. And when you change what you think about from day to day, you're intentionally making structural changes in your brain for the purpose of helping yourself or harming yourself in some way. The problem is that the default state, so if you're not aware of this, and we call it, the psychologists call it metacognition, this ability to think about what you're thinking and feeling and then
Mhm.
decide how to respond to it rather than just experiencing it and living it as if you're obligated to. And most people never get out of that reacting phase. We just live in this place where our brain tells us what to be afraid of and we react to that. And so if you can get into that space, then you begin to wire your brain in accordance with what you intend instead of what you experience. And that makes structural changes that begin to help you, because the default state is to just continue rewiring every day the things that you have previously done. And so that's why people who are anxious, for example, they feel anxious, they think about how anxious they are, they worry that they might be anxious if they go to this place again, or if the phone rings, it might be bad news, and they begin to think about what they're feeling, and the brain says, "Okay, I guess I'm supposed to be anxious." So it begins to wire in more robust connections to the hippocampus and the amygdala and parts of the brain that are related to anxiety. And over time, that becomes automated. As we talked about earlier, you automate the things that you repeatedly do. And there's a neuroscience finding called Hebb's Law, where the old famous saying is neurons that fire together wire together. And what Hebb figured out, a Canadian neuroscientist, Donald Hebb, is that when you repeatedly perform the same task, your brain makes robust connections to reinforce and automate that task and make it less conscious. And so, again, if you fixate on something, that thing becomes more real. And you'll think this is interesting down on the quantum level in your world. It's been shown now that this may relate to the old quantum Zeno effect, this idea that the more you pay attention to a system, the more fixed that system becomes, the more real it becomes, and it's hard for it to evolve out of that state. And there are people now who think that there's some quantum stuff related to repeated attention density on the aspect of what you're thinking about. So it turns out that we think we're stuck because we keep thinking about being stuck.
Do we have 2 hours? I mean, oh,
I hope so.
my mind is just going crazy listening to what you're saying. I'm going to set aside the quantum stuff right now, because that is, we could spend an hour or more on that alone. But I'm just
Right.
thinking, and you're a Christian, and I'm just
Right.
thinking about how the Bible says, "Fear not." I'm thinking of Philippians 4:8
Absolutely.
that says, "Think on all the good stuff." In effect, say, yeah, we live in a fallen world. It's full of misery, violence, all the rest of it. But don't think about that. And then I'm thinking of
That's right.
Romans 12:2, and I wrote this down because
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you. There's Roman. I've always felt Romans 12:2 was significant, and it's really significant with respect to our conversation. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new
Yeah.
person. What? By changing the way you think.
That's right.
Then
That's
you will
right.
learn
So
to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. Lee, I've always thought it significant that it says, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think, not by
that's
changing
right.
your habits, not by changing the way you think. That's what you're saying, because when we change the way we think, we change the wiring. Literally, you're saying, we can see this with neuroimaging. When we change the way we think, we change literally the physical structure of the brain, which then
Yeah.
affects our decisions, which then affects our reality. Have I got that right?
That's right. You got it exactly right. I'll
Oh
tell
my
you a
gosh.
story. I'll tell you a story to kind of cement that, where it came real to me, and really where this book came from. Like after our son Mitch died, you and I talked about that before. We lost
Yeah.
our son Mitch in 2013, and we were, of course, as any bereaved parent was, we were grieving and lost and angry and all those things that you do when you're hurting. And about a month after he died, we had to go back to work. Lisa ran our neurosurgery practice. At the time, we lived in Auburn, Alabama. And our office, it turned out, was on the third floor of the Auburn University MRI research complex. And on the first floor, they had what's called a 7 Tesla MRI scanner. And Tesla is a measure of how strong the magnet is. And at the time, there were only 3 7 Tesla scanners in the United States. And it was one of the first centers doing functional imaging research. So functional imaging, if you're not familiar, is like when you go get an x-ray and we take a picture of your arm, it shows us a picture of the bone inside. And just the thing. We're taking a picture of the organ or the structure. But functional imaging allows us to take a picture of what the organ is doing when it's doing its thing. And so you can put somebody's head in the functional scanner and you can see what parts of their brain are active when they're moving their thumb or they're saying a certain sentence or they're thinking about something. So we got invited to go down to this meeting right after Mitch died. We went back to work and we were struggling. And there was a meeting that we went down to watch in the functional MRI scanner. And they had a woman in the scanner with headphones on so they could communicate with her. And they said, Mrs. Johnson, think about the worst day of your life. Like, think about the hardest thing you've ever experienced. And we saw what her brain was doing before they told her to think about that. And then all of a sudden, she furrowed her brow. You could see her processing what they had instructed her to do. And then her brain began to change. Different blood flow patterns began to emerge in the amygdala and the hippocampus, the parts that are involved in fear and flight and anger and all that stuff. And then shortly after the neurochemistry of her brain began to change, her heart rate went up and her blood pressure went up and her body began to react physiologically to what her brain was doing. And then after a second, they said, okay, Mrs. Johnson, now stop thinking about that and start remembering the best feeling you've ever felt in your life, the happiest you've ever been in your whole life. And then shortly after that, the amygdala calms down, the frontal lobes and the insula and the prefrontal cortex come online. And then her heart rate comes down, her blood pressure comes down. All these things start to change in response to what she's thinking. And so we saw really clearly, and me as a neuroscientist, who was also a hurting father right then, I'm hearing all these negative messages from my brain and all this hopelessness and all these thoughts. We watched a thought turn into brain activity and turn into physiological activity. And Lisa, my wife, said, that reminds me of Philippians 4. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, the Bible says, don't be anxious for anything, but be grateful and be thankful and think about all this different good stuff and you'll be at peace. And it dawned on me right then, that's exactly what we were seeing, right? We were seeing that God has built into us a mechanism of choosing what we think about, and our brains will respond in a healthy or harmful way depending on what we choose to think about. And then that was the beginning of the idea of self-brain surgery right there. Like, these people can change what their brains are doing. And you and I know underneath, it's not just metaphoric, like underneath blood flow changes in the brain, when we're seeing neurochemical changes, that means that genes are getting transcribed or turned off. It means that neurotransmitters are getting produced. It means that hormones are being packaged and sent around the brain and different glands are getting activated. Like, physical things are happening in response to this immaterial mental event that was happening before. And then you go to Romans 12, and you just mentioned Romans 12:2, but I'll back you up one verse to 12:1. And Romans 12:1 says, I urge you to present your bodies as a living sacrifice to God, as an act of reasonable worship. So he's saying, when you give God your body and you do good things with your body, it's worship. And then in verse 2, it says, but don't be like the world, change your mind. And so I would just suggest that Romans 12:1 is about your body, which includes your brain. And Romans 12:2 is about your mind. Mm-hmm. And he's telling you that if you want to please God and you want to have a better life, change your mind, and that will change your brain, and that will change your body. So there it is in a nutshell.
Brother, I mean, yeah, it's deep. I love it. You mentioned something in the book that I love. You call it thought biopsy. Tell us about that. Thought biopsy. Yeah, so I love it.
If you came into my office, okay, if you came into my office and you said, Doc, I've been having headaches. If the first thing I said was, well, let's just go to the operating room and I'll cut it out. I'll look around in there and see if I can find something. You would say, wait a second, like don't you want to scan or some kind of information before you go cutting into my head, right? I mean, you would want me to gather data before I made a decision about what to do based on a symptom. And we know from psychology research now and from neuroimaging research that about 80% of the automatic thoughts and feelings that pop into our heads, about 80% of them are false, overwhelmingly negative, 5-1, and mostly false. So if you wrote down the 5 most common thoughts that you had 5 or 6 days in a row, 90% of them, we've learned, are the same thoughts that you thought the day before. And about 80% of them turn out to be never true. And so that means that the things that we think and feel from brain activity aren't very reliable. And so if you have a habit of reacting to everything you think or feel as if it's true, you're going to find yourself in your life a lot of times having to unwind things, undo things, apologize for things because you reacted to a text message or you overreacted to an email or something before you realized you needed more information. So the thought biopsy is just this idea that just as a surgeon, I need to gather data and examine things, be curious about them before I take definitive action on them, as if I was in the operating room. If you can do that with your thinking, then you'll have a better outcome, right? You'll say, wow, I feel this, I need to react to it. And every time I do, I end up in trouble. I have to send them an apology email or something. I get in trouble with HR. I, yell at somebody. And if instead I can think about that thought or feeling and examine it and decide, is this true? Is it helpful? Is it necessary for me to respond to right now? Is it going to harm anyone if I respond to this? Then I'm gathering data and I'm using my prefrontal cortex, the big healthy part of my brain that helps me make good decisions, instead of that little bitty amygdala that's all about fear and anger and all that stuff. And so it's just this idea of gather data, be curious about your thinking, get metacognitive about it, be a scientist about what you're thinking and feeling rather than a reactive person, and you'll have a better outcome. So just like in surgery, you can do that in your real life too.
So once you do this biopsy, and I love the analogy, Leah. I mean, I love everything about this book. I mean, you're amazing, guy, but we already
Thank
knew
you.
that. What I love about it is once you perform this thought biopsy,